Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and joining me today is Dr. Nicholas Humphrey. He is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the London School of Economics, visiting Professor of Philosophy at the New College of the Humanities, and Senior Member at Darwin College, Cambridge. Dr. Humphrey is a theoretical psychologist who is known for his work on the evolution of human intelligence and consciousness. His interests are wide-ranging. He studied mountain gorillas with Dian Fossey in Rwanda. He was the first to demonstrate the existence of blindsight after brain damage in monkeys. He proposed the celebrated theory of the social function of intellect, and he is the only scientist ever to edit the literary journal Granta. His books include Consciousness Regained, The Inner Eye, A History of the Mind, Leaps of Faith, The Mind Made Flesh, Seeing Red, and Soul Dust. He has been the recipient of several honors, including the Martin Luther King Memorial Prize, the British Psychological Society's Book Award, the Pufendorf Medal, and the International Mind and Brain Prize. So, Dr. Humphrey, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a real pleasure to everyone.
Good, I'm very happy to do it.
Okay, thank you. So, I invited you today basically to talk about consciousness and intelligence, particularly the evolution of both of these mental features, let's say. So the first question I would like to ask you is, and because I've already had several different philosophers of mind on the show, and other people that also do work on evolutionary theory, I guess that one of the most problematic things when we talk about consciousness is that there's not a unanimous definition of consciousness. There's not one in science nor in philosophy. So, I mean, do you think that that's a problem?
Ricardo, I don't think...
Yes, please.
Ricardo, I don't think... Sorry, I'm talking over you. Ricardo, I don't think that is such a problem at all. We can define consciousness very simply as that of which we are conscious. And we know what it means to be conscious. We know the contrast between being unconscious and conscious. When we're conscious, we have access to the contents of our minds, to the feelings, thoughts, perceptions, memories, and so on, as if we're actually looking in on the theater of the mind. And I think we can define consciousness as just what is there, what we discover. Now, of course, now we need to make some divisions within that. For example, I think that we want to say that sensations stand out as being a very special part of consciousness because they have this remarkable qualitative feel to them. But I think we should also include among consciousness thoughts and memories and volitions and so on. Sensations, though, present to philosophy and to science, I think, the hard problem. They're the ones which really seem to, at the moment, be beyond physical explanation. David Chalmers famously distinguished between the hard and the easy problems of consciousness. The easy problems, he said, are the ones which we know in principle how to solve already, and which we could already, if we wanted to, actually build into a mechanism. The hard problems are the ones which, at the moment, we can't seem to get any theoretical or mechanistic grip on. And sensation, pains, feelings, sights, sounds, that's the real puzzle for the future.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you're very fond of evolutionary psychology. Do you think that evolutionary theory or any sort of evolutionary approach can help us with some insights into how and why consciousness evolved? And in what ways? I mean, do you think that it can also help us answer the hard problem of consciousness?
I think it's the only thing which can help us. Certainly, if we don't approach it from an evolutionary point of view, we don't have anywhere to begin. I'm not saying that we yet know the answer, but I'm quite certain that the answer will come through trying to work out what the history of consciousness has been in our species, and presumably in other animals as well, and why what the payoff was, what the biological advantage of having the kind of consciousness which we enjoy has been. Now, I say that's the way we must go, but of course immediately I'm raising problems which for some philosophers would say that, okay, that's the end of the inquiry, because consciousness doesn't have consequences. I say we need to look at the biological effects it has, how it actually helps us to lead better lives and in the end to have more offspring so that the genes responsible for consciousness can be passed on. But then some philosophers say, no, you're not going to go, can't go that way, because nothing on the surface reveals consciousness. And if you can't tell whether another being or another organism is conscious from the outside, then nor can natural selection, the process which operates to select one pattern of brain development over another. I hear what they're saying, and I say, well, yes, what you're doing effectively is showing that how your approach must be mistaken, because if consciousness hasn't evolved, how else has it got here? And if it has evolved, it must be having effects on the surface.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that it's important for us to learn about the functions of consciousness and how it might have affected our fitness and basically deal with it as a sort of adaptation?
Yes, I'm sure that's what we need to do. Again, there's going to be different aspects to this problem. As we said at the beginning, consciousness is a rather broad definition. It includes everything which goes on in our minds. Some aspects of consciousness which have to do just with integrating information and bringing things together so that the brain can basically work on many aspects of a problem at the same time. That aspect of consciousness has an obvious function, and it's not difficult to explain. What is difficult to explain is why the qualities of sensation should be like they are, why the redness of red should be as it is, the painfulness of pain. Now, you might say, well, of course, those have an obvious function. The redness of which we receive through vision helps us to see colors, or the pain of pain helps us to avoid injury. Now, that's true, and yet it doesn't answer the question, because why shouldn't red look like green? Why shouldn't painfulness feel like pleasure? As long as it's having the functional effects, it'll be selected. But what makes the actual content, the qualitative content, be like it is? There's, of course, the famous problem which occurred to John Locke, the philosopher, a long time ago, of what he called spectrum inversion, color inversion. He said, how do we know that what you see as marigold, yellow, isn't what I see as violet? And he said, no, we can't tell that. But if we can't tell it, then nor can natural selection, nor can the process of evolution. And therefore there would be a problem. Again, I have to say that that kind of inversion of colors in conscious experience would have to have some external effect. And it must have done, or else it wouldn't have evolved. Our experiences wouldn't have evolved in the way they have. Which pushes me to then ask, well, what is it about the central qualities of consciousness which are so significant? And that makes me look at it particularly from an aesthetic and an emotional point of view. I ask what it is, how does the experience of colors and pains and so on, how does the very uncanny nature of these, the fact that we can't explain them, how does that affect how we feel about the world outside and about our own place within in the world? And so one aspect which I've always recently been following is to say, well, if it wasn't for consciousness, we would have a very much more limited understanding of what it is to be us. Because we have the kind of consciousness we have, we immediately think of ourselves as being unique and special and somehow metaphysically important. Now you might say, well, what's it matter to be metaphysically important? I think it matters like anything, because it makes us believe in ourselves as individuals with the significance we attach to that individuality, and also to then extend that to other people in our community. In my last book, Soul Dust, for example, I built up from that to saying that, yes, that sense of self is in fact the basis for what in human culture has become the idea of the immortal soul. And the idea of the immortal soul has actually been hugely important in driving our evolution. If you look around at the history of human beings, as far as we know it, every different society has believed in the specialness of the soul, has thought that that was what made life worth living and preserving. And it's managed, and it's been one of the most powerful forces in driving evolution, cultural evolution, making us want to invest in our own lives and even to consider the possibility of life after death, again, with very significant consequences for our own evolved biology.
So let's talk a little bit about the self, because isn't it the case, or at least some people say this, that what we call the self and the thing in our minds that we as individuals identify with, that itself is an illusion? I mean, is there something in our minds that really unites all of our conscious experiences and phenomena that go around in our minds into one single unity that we could call the self, or is that really illusory?
Well, it's not illusory. I mean, because in fact it's effective. It's actually our sense of self is what channels our thoughts and our interactions with other people and with the outside world. We know how different from the examples of pathology, when people don't have a good sense of self, or where even they feel their self is split. We know how that can undermine their behavior. We have a consistent attitude towards what it's like to be us, and therefore we present ourselves in a particular way, and we expect other people to see us as being a unity, just as I see your face now, and I imagine behind those eyes a unified self. It's very important to the way I understand you and how this is going to be the best way to interact with you. I don't think there's a problem from a kind of software point of view of understanding why or how this idea of there being a kind of central controller of the mind's activity could have arisen. I think, in fact, it actually corresponds pretty much to the truth of how our brains work. People who work on the neuroscience of consciousness now are continually talking about how consciousness occupies the global workspace, which is accessible by the language language apparatus in our brain. Language, certainly, in our own case, has been hugely significant in unifying the self. But for animals which are non-linguistic, I'm sure that they also have a sense that at any one moment, it's these particular experiences belong together.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so since the self is so important and perhaps having a central unit, let's say, of control in our minds is so important, how do you make sense of the fact, or how do you think about the interplay between that and the fact that we have so much occurring at an unconscious level? And I mean, even when people think and talk about their own behavior, the motivations behind their behaviors and so on and so forth, I mean, it's very frequent that they are not that good at identifying what is really happening with their behavior and at the level of their minds.
I don't think it's very frequent. I mean, I agree there are some aspects of ourselves which are not accessible, or some aspects which we even are mistaken about. But if we were mistaken all the time, and that would be disastrous, we need to have a story of our own lives to understand why we're doing the things we do. And we need it partly so that we can project a rational sense of a rational self out into the world to interact with other people. But also it becomes a model of how we understand other people. If I was wrong to assume that you have access to your own feelings and thoughts and desires and so on, I would find it very difficult to predict what you're going to do. I've learned from my own behavior that most of the time I have a pretty good story I can tell about the decisions I make, why I decide this, why I decide that, which way I'm going to go in the future and so on. That it works for me. It turns out to be a very good theory of mind. Now, that theory of mind necessarily has to center around about there being a mind which has this central role. Now, I have discovered a theory of myself centered around the idea of a single unified I, which has access to all these very different aspects of mental life. And I use that to understand not only myself, but to understand other people. In my earliest work on consciousness, I thought that is indeed the most important function of consciousness, to provide us with a model for understanding how the mind works, which we can then use to project onto other people and to get inside them, as it were, to understand them as if we were in their shoes. And I argued that that has been crucial to the development of social life in animals like ourselves and in our immediate ancestors, whose very survival in the world depends on their skill at being psychologists. So I argued that we need to be what I called natural psychologists. We need to be amazingly skilled at understanding how human beings work. And consciousness, I think, is a very, very good trick for doing that, because it allows us to work with this kind of inner model of which we can then project outside.
Okay, so I was asking if you think that there is any version of mind-brain dualism that might still be relevant nowadays.
But the short answer is no. Of course, as a scientific theory, it makes no sense at all. But on the other hand, it's the way a lot of people still think, and we want to understand them. Of course, we need to understand the nature of the model they're using, about what kind of creature they are, the nature of their self. Now, in a way, I think that we are all dualists because we believe in and center all our narratives around the idea of a self which in a sense is non-physical, which is basically defined particularly by the quality of the sensations which we have. And those sensations are not, at the moment, things we can understand in physical terms. So the very center, my core self in a way, is immaterial. Now, I don't believe in the long run that's going to turn out to be a good scientific theory if it is, but it's the one I work with. And so I think what consciousness has provided us with is a model of the self which actually promotes dualism, and dualism is quite a good way of approaching other human beings, because if I assumed you were just a machine, I wouldn't have anything like the skill at predicting your behavior that I have when I assume that you actually are a human being like me with an immaterial soul.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that we have to take seriously into account people's folk psychology and people's common sense about the ways their own consciousness works?
Yes, I think absolutely we do. I mean, you said, yes, but we make mistakes about ourselves, and many people say that our theory of the mind is not as good as it could be. But my answer is actually look at it the other way around. It is so good compared with any kind of behaviorist, Skinnerian kind of model of how human beings work. Our folk psychology centered around consciousness turns out, and belief desire psychology, as sometimes folk theories called, is astonishingly good at making sense. If it wasn't, we wouldn't succeed as social beings in the way we do. It not only helps us to understand ourselves, by the way, it helps us to understand other animals too. And I'm quite sure that in our more recent past, when our lives depended on being able to read the minds of prey species, of the deer or the bison or whatever it is that we were hunting, then folk psychology centered on the idea of an immortal, immaterial self was also a good way of understanding how the horse or the cow or the leopard was going to behave.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's any good way for us to be sure that other animals or animal models also have a consciousness or experience some sort of conscious phenomena? Because, can we study that through their behavior, or is it the case that approaches like studying the neural correlates of consciousness would work better?
I don't think we can do it at the moment. I mean, of course, we assume that most these higher mammals, for example, monkeys and dogs and horses, have some form of consciousness which resembles what we know in our own case. But the reason we know it in our own case, and the reason I assume it in you, for example, or other humans, is a rather high level one. It's because, for example, you're interested in consciousness. The fact that you ask me questions about it, the fact that you think it's puzzling and so on, is one of the best bits of evidence I have that actually there's something going on in you which resembles what's going on in me. Now, of course, you know, dogs don't ask questions about consciousness. They don't seem to be puzzled by it. They don't write books or read books about the nature of the soul. So we don't have that kind of evidence that they're having a similar experience to us. And it could be that they're not. I mean, I've seriously thought about the possibility that consciousness as we know it may be a very recent innovation, a recent invention of evolution, and that basically we might be the only conscious creatures on Earth, maybe in the universe, because the evidence is certainly there for us, but at the moment it's not there for any other creature. Now that would be a very surprising thing if it's true, because on the whole, evolution doesn't make sudden jumps like that. But it does do sometimes. I mean, no one questions, for example, that humans are the only creatures that have language. The language of animals, so far as it has anything there, doesn't resemble ours in any way at all. It doesn't have any of the sophistication, the recursion, the grammar, the syntax, and so on, which makes human language what it is. So human language is a one-off, something which has evolved presumably only in the last 300,000 or 400,000 years. Consciousness could be in the same class. It could be something which only became part of our lives 300,000 or 400,000 years ago. And what would the evidence be for that? Well, for example, it might be that it's around then that human beings, our ancestors, started taking care of the dead, obviously considering the possibility of life after death and the needs of the soul after it had left the body. Now, that kind of way of thinking, again, suggests that those ancestors had a notion of consciousness rather like ours. So that would be evidence. But again, we don't have any of that kind of evidence for animals. They don't bury their dead. They don't apparently care about the future of the mind of an individual who's passed away. So, I mean, I'm not going to argue this as a strong scientific theory, but nonetheless, I think we should consider the possibility that human consciousness is unique and that it doesn't have precedence in the minds of animals. People find that idea very offensive, of course, because they like to believe that consciousness is shared all across the animal kingdom. At least most of them like to believe that. Some philosophers would be actually very pleased to think that animals don't have consciousness like ours, because then we wouldn't have to worry about their suffering in the way which we worry about human suffering. So it can cut both ways. I mean, it would be very, one way, it would be very uncomfortable to believe that no one experiences the world like we do. On the other hand, it might be a big relief. We wouldn't have to be vegans.
Right, exactly. But I guess that it's also very interesting to talk about if other animals have consciousness or not, because it could be very well the case that they don't, but at the same time other animals are also able to perform very complex behaviors. And so if it was the case that they didn't have any consciousness at all, then wouldn't it be harder for us to understand why consciousness evolved or what consciousness evolved for? Because, I mean, we could perfectly be zombies, right?
Yeah, well, okay, again, we're maybe talking about two levels of consciousness. Mm-hmm. I'm certain that other animals have the cognitive consciousness which allows them to integrate information in their minds and solve problems and so on. That is not the same issue as whether they have phenomenal experiences, whether they have sensations like we do. And I think many people don't understand that. They assume there's a very close correlation between intelligence and sophisticated thought machinery and sensation. If you look at Frans de Waal's books, for example, lovely book he just wrote called Mama's Last Hug about chimpanzee, and he's got no question, no doubt that chimpanzees have conscious feelings like we do. But if you look at the evidence for it, what he does is he just cites evidence of how clever chimpanzees are, which isn't the same issue at all. I mean, if that was all that mattered, then we'd soon have to attribute consciousness to sophisticated robots, for example, which will soon certainly be as clever as chimpanzees and maybe cleverer than human beings. But at least, in my view, the fact that they have this level of intelligence won't in any way suggest that they have in a conscious life like we do, that certainly at the level of sensation. What I'd want for that would be evidence of just the kind we were talking about, that they're asking questions about the nature of their experience, that they're surprised by it, that they wonder at the miracle, in the sense of feelings, seeing colors and smells and feeling pains and so on. If and when machines started asking those questions, just as if animals did, then I'd be convinced. But at the moment, I don't think we need to assume that that any animals have consciousness because they're clever, or that any machine will do if we designed it to be clever.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that if any other animal exhibited some sort of behavior like language or artistic behavior or cumulative culture, then that would point toward them having some sort of phenomenal consciousness or not?
Well, yes, at some point, of course I would, because I say if humans, I think we do have evidence, and if animals ever began behaving in those particular ways, like humans, as I said, asking philosophical questions, yes, that would be good evidence. Language in its own right, I'm not so sure. I mean, of course, Descartes thought that language was closely correlated with consciousness, and he thought that human beings were not only the only animals with souls, but the only animals who could reason, and could reason because they had language. I don't think we any longer need believe that. I think language could be a purely mechanical function. I mean, we already have devices, we probably carry them around in our pockets, which can understand spoken English at some level. Certainly they can translate it, and they can emit language with an intention to influence whoever's listening. But we don't think they're conscious because of that. So I'm rather conservative. I think consciousness is very special, very remarkable. I think it's taken a lot of design work by evolution, by natural selection, in the case of human beings, even if it was relatively recently. And without that design work, I don't think it would have come into existence. It isn't just a kind of free gift which comes with complexity, which again is what a lot of people assume. They assume any sufficiently complex system will begin to have consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. But I just don't buy that.
Mm-hmm. So let me just ask you this to make this point clear. So do you think that the only sort of behaviors that would prove that a particular animal also has consciousness apart from humans would be more complex behaviors similar to ours, like, for example, as we said, cumulative culture or artistic behavior? And I'm asking you this because just to make the part about behavior a little bit more clear, because it seems to me that if we are to discount completely behavior as a source of evidence for consciousness, then we would only have people's own reports to rely on, right?
Well, we can't discount behavior as evidence for consciousness because, as I was trying to argue earlier, in the course of evolution, natural selection could only work on differences in behavior, produced presumably by underlying genes. So if consciousness isn't manifest in behavior, it can't have evolved by Darwinian natural selection. So at some level, yes, it must be making a difference at the level of behavior. But the question is exactly what kinds of behavior. And my argument is that consciousness doesn't provide us with any particular skills. It doesn't provide us with greater intelligence. It needn't even be what provides us with a sense of art or of humor or anything else. all those things I can imagine being programmed without consciousness. What consciousness, in my view, does is to change our sense of self. It changes our psychology, the idea of what kind of creature we are, and so by extension of what kind of creatures other human beings are. Now, that's at a very high level, but it may have made all the difference in the development of human beings, all the difference at the very beginning of human culture, lifting us suddenly above any other animal on Earth, because of the ways in which we interacted with each other, interacting not just with each other as animals or even as other humans, but as souls, as others human beings possessed with this inner life of the mind, which we value so strongly in our own case. Or I could say, because philosophers sometimes use this word, consciousness led us to believe in the idea of persons. A person is not just a person is a creature who has an inner responsibility to themselves based on an idea of their own future and of their own capacities and of their own significance. I don't think at the moment we have any reason to believe that other animals think of each other at the level of persons. And I mean, of course, nobody could expect that literally to be true, but I don't think they even begin to think I don't think chimpanzees think of other chimps as the equivalent of what we mean by a person. And I'm sure that dogs and cats don't.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that it in any way would be possible for consciousness to, not having been directly selected for during our evolution, but simply to be a byproduct of other mental phenomena?
Well, if you think that the plays of Shakespeare might just have been a byproduct of somebody typing on a typewriter randomly, then of course it's not impossible. But I think consciousness shows all the signs of having been extraordinarily carefully designed for a purpose. So it won't just have arisen out of just getting accumulated levels of complexity. At some point, consciousness must have begun to make a difference, which was changed the way we relate to ourselves and to each other. And at that point, natural selection will have moved in and begun to design our brains to increase the workings or the effects of this new faculty which we acquired. I know there are people, of course, who believe that consciousness goes all the way down, so-called panpsychists, who think that consciousness is present in very nature of matter, and even a teacup has a little bit of consciousness in it. But I think that's a very incoherent and certainly a very lazy theory. It doesn't help us explain anything at all. Bertrand Russell once nicely said that the method of postulating what you want to find is very convenient. It has many advantages. They are the advantages of theft over honest toil. In other words, you steal the idea and then you incorporate it into your model. Now that's effectively what panpsychists do. They're not explaining anything. But even if we're not panpsychists, I don't think there's any evidence that primitive organisms have consciousness, or that it's graded from there up to the levels we know. As you will hear, understand from where I'm talking, I think consciousness is a high-level phenomenon. It's pretty much all or nothing. And people who say, well, how can it be all or nothing? Everything's graded. And there are no discontinuities in nature. Well, there are. Look at the discontinuity which occurs when you wake up in the morning or when you go to sleep. Consciousness is an abrupt transition. So if it's been an abrupt transition in each of our lives as we live them today, it presumably might have been equally abrupt in the development of the embryo, which grew up to become a human being like us, and equally in the history of our species. There could have been an abrupt transition of that kind. And I actually can't make sense of the nature of consciousness without thinking of it as being an all or nothing phenomenon.
Do you think that consciousness could have evolved to serve primarily a social function? I mean, just to put it in other words, do you think that some sort of solitary, alone animal would have evolved consciousness?
No, I think you're implying that it's only become significant in the context of social life, of social interaction, and I'd absolutely agree with that. That's in a sense where my first speculations about consciousness began, when I was, developing the idea of the social function of intellect, and then of human beings as having their social intelligence depending on being what I called natural psychologists, who did their psychology by projecting their own experience onto the lives of other human beings, by imagining other human beings to have an inner life like their own. I think that's where consciousness began, and I think that its very special qualities have had to do with the nature of when we think of ourselves, not just as as input-output mechanisms, or as efficient or maximizers of this or that utility. No, we're more than that. We are selves with a particular value, which transcends apparently the nature, the materials of which we're made. And now that's a different view. It's a special view of what it's like to be a human. It's a view of what it's like to be a person or soul, and that has been, I think, what's driven the evolution of consciousness, what's made it so valuable and so, in a sense, worth investing in by evolution. But to go back to your question, if we led solitary lives, no, it would hardly have got off the ground.
Mm-hmm. So, in your previous answers, you referred several times to things like intelligence and the intellect. From an evolutionary perspective, how do you think about intelligence and the interplay between intelligence and consciousness?
Well, two questions there. I think, how clever does any animal need to be? It depends, of course, on what problems it has to solve in the world in which it lives. In the past, and really until about 30, 40 years ago, everybody assumed that the reason for an animal to be intelligent and the reason for a human being to be intelligent was because we have to solve practical problems to do with, navigation or building or design of tools, whatever it might be. That was what people imagined drove the evolution of intelligence. And then, first in the 1970s, I said, no, I think it can't be like that. You actually ask what are the kinds of problems people and animals have to face in their lives. They often, at the level of technology, they're not very difficult. I spent, as you mentioned in the introduction, several months with Dian Fossey in Africa, working with gorillas there. I sat with these huge, wonderful animals in the forest, watching what they were doing. I was very impressed by the size of their heads, of course. They had very large brains. And we also know that they're very intelligent, because we know that from tests in the laboratory. But in the wild, in the forest, I never saw them using their intelligence. Life was really pretty easy, or so it seemed. And then I suddenly had a different take on it, because I began to look more closely at the interactions between the different gorillas in the social group. And at that point, it dawned on me, yes, okay, here is where real demands are being put on intelligence. Here's where the animals are having to use their brains at their full capacity in order to predict and understand and manipulate the other individuals in their group. So that led to what I called originally the social intelligence hypothesis, and that's taken off in a very big way. I think it's almost everybody now agrees that the primary driver of the evolution of intelligence has been the needs of social life, and that's why social animals apparently, we know even in the laboratory, have so much greater skills at solving intellectual problems. They don't use those skills in relation to the outside world, but they continually use them in relation to each other. So intelligence was crucial, and a huge increase in intelligence was crucial to allowing humans and our ancestors to develop the kind of social networks which they do. So that was my original understanding of how human society works. And then, again, I thought a bit further about it and realized that actually, it doesn't matter how clever you are, you're never going to understand the behavior of another human being. The task is just too difficult. it's too difficult unless you have some other tool to use, some other trick of reasoning, of understanding, which will help you get inside the mind of another human being. And that's when I said, well, okay, cleverness isn't enough. We also need consciousness, which gives us this other way in, this way of modeling other creatures, which we never get to by just being observing external behavior. And in sense, the history of psychology has shown that for years and years and years, people tried to understand behavior simply by looking at the external events in an animal or human's life. And the schools of behaviorism, starting with J.B. Watson all the way through to B.F. Skinner and others, were trying to show how you don't need to postulate anything about the inner life. You just need to understand the relationships between inputs and outputs at the level of behavior, and then you'll have a model for how the animal or the human's going to behave. Well, it didn't work. Meanwhile, of course, introspective psychology had been working for generations. And that's what gave me the clue, in fact. Okay, then introspective psychology has been the way we've evolved to solve these problems. But for that to work, we need to have consciousness. We need to be able to introspect the contents of our own minds and then apply those to understanding other creatures.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that in your answer you refer to the fact that there are animals, like for example gorillas in that case, that when they are in captivity or when they're studied in the lab, they exhibit some mental capacities or some intellectual capacities that they don't exhibit as much in the wild. So do you think that that gives us any interesting insights into how intelligence works and how it evolved? Because it's interesting that fact that if you expose the same animal to different environmental stimuli, let's say, that they exhibit higher intellectual capacity, right?
But I'm just to take you up on what you just said. It's not true they don't show this level of intelligence in the wild. They only show it, though, in one area of their lives, which is, of course, by far the most important area, and that is interacting with the other members of their social group. So I think what we're picking up in the laboratory are intellectual skills being studied in abstract, which haven't got any real application outside the social life of the group. And that's why there's, people like Robin Dunbar, for example, he then built on that to show that if you try and correlate the size of the brain with the complexity of the social group in which the animal lives, you find a very close relationship. The more complex the group, the larger the brain of the animal which typically lives there. And of course, the argument would be, well, if natural selection has put all this design work into it, it must have been because it was the brain, this large brain and high intelligence, which permitted this level of social complexity. But all this, as I was saying earlier, at least most of it could have occurred without consciousness having been a central part of it. I think theory of mind came late. And I said theory of mind is crucial to us as introspective psychologists. When we look at animals, and people have now, of course, tested for it, there's very little evidence that they have theory of mind, that they can, in fact, use their own experience to model the experience of another creature in their group. There's a little bit of evidence. I mean, in chimpanzees, yes, they probably at least are on the edge of it. Some evidence, in fact, better evidence for dogs. The dogs, of course, have evolved in the context of humans. It's been claimed that rooks and jackdaws can show evidence of theory of mind, but I'm not really greatly convinced. No animal, at any rate, comes close to the level of a 4-year-old human child. It's been a real puzzle. As people thought once they started looking for theory of mind in animals, they would find it everywhere amongst more highly intelligent animals, but they just don't. It really, test a monkey, a rhesus monkey, for theory of mind. No evidence for it at all. It doesn't even understand what it's like for another creature to be in pain.
But I mean, it's still interesting that they are able to be at least trained to perform the kinds of tests that people put them through in the laboratory, right? Because sometimes they are really somewhat, or at least to a certain extent, detached from the kinds of problems that they have to deal with in their everyday lives, right?
Sure, and same for humans, of course. I mean, my son has just been taking exams in physical chemistry in Oxford. He's having to use his mind and his intelligence in ways which are totally irrelevant to his everyday life. But his everyday life centers around going to the pub. But of course, in the pub and in his relationships with his friends, that's of course where he is going to need the skills he has, and which can also be applied in the area of chemistry if you wish to.
So do you think that basically people and other animals are able to repurpose some of the mental or the cognitive mechanisms that they've acquired through processes of natural selection to acquire new cognitive tools from their environment?
Yes, sure. And I've even argued that it's been very important in the development of human understanding of the world, that we have used social intelligence to understand what is not really a social a world of social beings at all. I mean, if you start thinking about physics or chemistry or astronomy in social terms, it turns out to be rather rewarding. That thinking of people, even physicists, talk about families of particles and so on, which show things like charm and spin and so on. They think very much in human psychological terms. Now, the particular example I've thought might have been rather important in our own history is agriculture. I think that by thinking of plants and the world, nature itself, as being responsive to our wishes, as having a mind of its own, having needs and being capable of deception and being capable of cheating and cooperation and so on, by thinking of the area of inorganic nature, but also particularly of vegetable nature in those ways, it actually led to ways of creative ways of exploiting the environment, which we wouldn't have had if we hadn't made, in a sense, the mistake of thinking of the vegetable garden as having a mind.
Mm-hmm. And those are culturally acquired tools, right?
Well, they're wired. They're ingrained in our minds, of course, through culture. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's just explore one last topic here that I think is very interesting. And since we're talking about consciousness, could you tell us about how do you think about the relationship between consciousness and the evolution of suicide?
Yes, I've been recently puzzling about the evolution of suicide and trying to understand how humans can have lived with the possibility of suicide and are able to now, when in fact it's so clearly maladaptive. Suicide is extraordinarily common amongst human beings, and there's every reason to think it has been throughout human history. Now, I've no doubt that in some sense it's not adaptive. It's obviously the very opposite of adaptive to remove oneself from the world without any benefit to any of our kin or our relations or our friends. I think that it's a mistake which has come about because firstly humans began to understand the nature of mortality. They understood the nature of death, and the most important insight they had is that death means oblivion. After you're dead, you don't feel any longer. No animal understands that. All human beings do now, partly through just discussion of this problem and wondering and imagining the life of what it would happen after you're dead. But if you can lose your mind by killing yourself, that's actually a very dangerous thought, because in many times in our life, there are times when we want to escape. We've been programmed, as all animals have been, to try and avoid pain, to get out of a situation in which we're suffering. If we can do that by killing ourselves, then of course the temptation will be to do exactly that. And I think that that's responsible, or it obviously is responsible, for a great deal of the actual suicides which now occur amongst human beings. They're impulsive, they're not thought through, except in the sense that the subject wants to get out of this situation as soon as possible. And almost always, it's a decision which people would regret if they had to choose again. We know that because it's actually very rare that people try and commit suicide more than once. It isn't something they repeat. I mean, there are exceptions to all this. On the whole, suicide is one-off impulsive action. Now, what I started thinking about then was, well, if humans are at risk in this way of killing themselves out of impulse in order to escape from suffering, whatever it might be, when in fact they should have somehow come to terms with the situation and continued to live and to work their lives out in the long term in a much better way. If the risk has been there that people will nonetheless jump ship, what's been there to stop them? And so I thought that at least one of the defenses which nature may have built into us against suicide would be a sense of the extraordinary beauty of being alive, of the wonder of just being us, of being sensing living creatures who can bathe in the sunlight and in the sound of the birds and have the smell of the flowers on their nose and so on, which can, as somebody said about young Werther, Goethe's hero who killed himself. A German critic said, well, here's somebody who obviously didn't understand the smell of bread, the smell of new-made bread. That's all you need to not commit suicide. Now, of course, that's not quite true, but nonetheless, I think it is at least partly true that one of the greatest reasons not to kill oneself is the delight of waking up in the morning to the sounds and smells and the delights of sensory experience. And so I think that it could have been quite a significant driver of consciousness in human beings. Only human beings are at risk of suicide. Maybe only humans needed this extra incentive to value life, which consciousness provides.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that there are specific aspects of consciousness that influence people to commit suicide, or are you thinking about simply our conscious mental experiences in general?
No, well, I think, as I said, I think it's human cognitive evolution which made suicide a possibility. To commit suicide, you have to understand what the consequences of death will be. That's a very sophisticated idea, and it doesn't occur to animals. It probably didn't occur to human beings until recently, 100,000 years ago, I would guess. But once you've reached the level where you realize that by killing yourself, you can remove yourself from the world of the mind, not only of the body, that your experiences are over, you'll enjoy oblivion, then the temptation is, in some circumstances, to actually choose oblivion over life. Now, so cognition was central. You had the only humans who could think that way were at risk of suicide. And that's why you don't find suicide in young children, for example. You don't find suicide in mentally retarded people. They're just not clever enough to think about what the advantages of suicide would be. They haven't actually learnt to understand it that way. But once you have got there, then the question is what kind of defenses might have been built in by evolution, if there's been time to do that. There are lots of cultural defenses against suicide. I mean, in every culture on Earth, suicide is present in every culture on Earth, and everywhere it's also forbidden, with all sorts of punishments promised for those who attempt to kill themselves and don't succeed, or punishments for their family if they do succeed. So there've been, in a sense, people have been bullied not to kill themselves. That still occurs. The reason why suicide is at a relatively low level, for example, in Muslim countries, is, I'm quite sure, because the threats of hell, which the Muslims believe will follow from suicide, are even stronger in the Muslim tradition than they are in the Catholic one, for example. Suicide is going to be punished. It's a message from religion. But I think, it doesn't work completely. People go on killing themselves. And I think, in fact, that human nature has also taken a different path, which is not necessary to think of the reasons not to avoid suicide because of the punishment which will follow, but to avoid suicide because of the lack of pleasure which will follow. What you're going to be missing. What is to me? How sad. You've only got 70 years on this earth, 80, 90 years maybe, for all eternity, before and since you won't exist. Then that's all there is. Then make the most of it. Carpe diem. Seize the day and seize the opportunity to live in this glorious world of sensory consciousness.
Mm-hmm. So you think that there are both innate mental mechanisms and knowledge that we acquire from our cultures that help prevent suicide?
I don't think, they're not that good. We're not very successful at preventing suicide. It's still astonishingly common. It's the leading cause of death in teenagers, for example. So I think there certainly are cultural ones. We've just been talking about some of them. I suspect that also there are natural ones in the sense, in the way our brains are designed. And in particular, I've suggested, though it's not a very strong thesis, that actually the fact that the world is so beautiful, and it's so beautiful because of its amazing richness at the level of sensory consciousness, that's an incentive not to leave the world. And it's I think in that paper I wrote about consciousness. I quoted from a wonderful novel called Lavengro, which is about a gypsy family, and the hero of the novel is talking about with a gypsy about how pointless life is, and saying that he doesn't see why he should continue. Why not kill himself? And the gypsy replies, "There's always the wind on the heath, brother. There's the sun and the moon and the stars, brother."
Right. Okay, so Dr. Humphrey, let's end on that note. And before we go, would you like to tell people what are some of the best places on the internet for them to learn a little bit more about your work?
Well, I suppose they can go to my website. It's easy to find. It's humphrey.org.uk. But if they Google my name, they'll find some books and some videos and some various other introductions to the kind of way I think, including, I hope, your film.
Yeah, let's hope that. So I will include that in the description box of the video, as well as your books and other stuff. So, Dr. Humphrey, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show again, and it was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, and for me too, thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you don't like Patreon, you also have the alternatives of Subscribestar and PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerreiro, Chantal Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Gondriano, Jana Eninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Gidi, Doctors Jerry Muller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingard, and also my 3 producers, Isar Webb, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.